The lobby of the conservatory was a world away from the one Leo knew. It was a place of shimmering light and soft, expensive sounds. The marble floor was so polished you could see your reflection in it, a blurry ghost moving among the elegant crowd. The air didn't smell of disinfectant and old mops like the hallways he was used to. It smelled of perfume, flowers, and a faint, clean scent of money. People dressed in fine clothes held delicate glasses of champagne, their laughter mixing with the crowd. Sharp voices of parents discussing their children's bright futures. Leo stood near the grand entrance, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn, gray uniform. He felt like a single, smudged fingerprint on a perfectly clean piece of glass. He was invisible, and yet he had never felt more exposed. For 15 years, Leo had been the one who cleaned this very lobby. He knew the exact spot where the marble chipped near the third column, a flaw he had carefully masked with a dab of polish. He knew how the morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows that he would chase away with his mop. He knew this room when it was empty and silent, a sleeping giant. But now it was awake, and it was filled with people who looked right through him. He was just the janitor, part of the background, fixture as unremarkable as the trash cans he emptied. But tonight was different. Tonight he wasn't here to clean. He was here to compete. The thought sent a nervous tremor through his hands, and he clenched them into fists inside his pockets. His heart was beating a little too fast, a frantic drum against his ribs. He watched as a young boy, no older than 12, walked past with his mother. The boy's suit was perfectly tailored, his hair was combed neatly, and his fingers, long and slender, were already flexing as if playing invisible keys. The mother, a woman draped in a silk shawl, was speaking in a loud, clear voice about the formidable repertoire her son had prepared. Leo looked down at his own hands, the hands of a working man. They were rough and calloused, the nails clipped short and clean, but marked by years of fixing leaky pipes and wringing out heavy mops. These were not a pianist's hands. A wave of doubt, cold and sharp, washed over him. What was he doing here? He remembered the promise he made, not in words, but in a shared silence. It was late one night about a year ago. The concert hall was empty, the stage dark, except for a single work light he had left on. His wife, Alina, was sitting in the very front row, just as she sometimes did. He would finish his cleaning, and then for a few stolen moments, he would sit at the grand piano and play. He never had a lesson. He couldn't read a note of music. But he had a music inside him, and the piano was the only place it could come out. He played what he felt: the sadness of a long day, the quiet joy of watching the sunrise, the deep, abiding love he had for the woman who listened to him in the empty hall. That night, he had finished a simple, melancholy tune, and the final note hung in the air like a question. He turned to look at her, and in the dim light he saw a single tear trace a path down her cheek. "You know, Leo," she had said, her voice soft but firm, "you play with your whole life, not just your fingers." People need to hear that. She had passed away a month later. That promise, that unspoken plea, was what had brought him here today. He was here for her. Taking a deep breath, he forced his feet to move. He walked towards the registration table, a long desk draped in black velvet, manned by 2 stern-looking volunteers. As he approached, a well-dressed man cut in front of him, slapping a credit card on the table. "I'm just here to observe, but my daughter is a finalist. A prodigy," he boasted. The volunteers smiled politely. Leo waited patiently, his heart thudding. When it was his turn, he stood quietly for a moment. One of the volunteers, a woman with sharp features and a tighter smile, looked him up and down. "Yes. Can I help you? Are you with one of the catering staff?" she asked, her tone polite but dismissive. Leo felt his face grow warm. He could feel the eyes of the people nearby turning towards him. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "No," he said, his voice quieter than he wanted it to be. "I'm here to register." For the competition. The woman's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up. She exchanged a quick, surprised look with her colleague. The young virtuoso competition?" she clarified, as if he must be mistaken. Leo just nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak again. He pulled a crumpled registration form from his pocket, the one he had printed out from the library computer. He had filled it out with his neat, simple handwriting. He placed it on the table. The woman picked it up as if it might be dirty. She scanned it, her confusion growing. But there's no teacher listed. No conservatory affiliation. I don't have one, Leo said simply. A small, incredulous laugh escaped the woman's lips before she could stop it. She quickly composed herself, but the damage was done. A few people nearby had overheard and were now staring openly. Leo could feel their judgment like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He was a joke. An absurdity. The janitor, who thought he could be a musician, he wanted to turn around, to walk out the door and disappear into the night. He wanted to go back to his quiet world of mops and melodies, where no one could laugh at him. But then he saw her face in his mind again. Alina sitting in the dark hall, her eyes closed, a gentle smile on her lips as she listened. He was doing this for her. He straightened his back, just a little. He looked the woman directly in the eye. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice a little stronger this time. The woman seemed taken aback by his quiet steadiness. "No," she said, a little flustered. "No, I suppose not. Here is your contestant number. Please wait in the designated area until your name is called." She handed him a small, flimsy card with the number 27 printed on it. Leo took it, his fingers brushing against hers. He turned and walked away, not looking back. He found a quiet corner near a large potted plant. He was trying to make himself as small as possible. He could still hear the whispers. They weren't loud, but they were sharp, and they found him easily. "Who is that man? Did you see his uniform? He must be a janitor or something. Some kind of prank, maybe." Each word was a tiny pinprick. He leaned against the wall, the cool plaster, a small comfort. He looked at the other contestants, huddled with their parents and teachers, their faces a mixture of nerves and confidence. They were a team. They had a support system. He was alone. He was just a man with a number, a memory, and a dream that felt more foolish with every passing second. He looked at his contestant number, then at his rough, work-worn hands. He thought about the piano waiting for him on that stage. It was his friend, his confidant. It was the only one who truly understood his music. He closed his eyes for a moment, blocking out the world, and just listened to the memory of a melody. He was here now. There was no turning back. The waiting area was a small, quiet room tucked away behind the main stage. It was nothing like the grand lobby. Here the walls were plain white, the furniture was simple and functional, and the air was thick with a tension that felt like a physical weight. A few of the other young contestants were scattered around, some staring at the ceiling, some nervously tapping their feet. One girl with her eyes closed, her fingers silently moving on her lap. Leo found a small chair in the corner and tried to make himself invisible again. From a speaker in the wall, the sound of a piano drifted into the room. It was the contestant before him. The music was a dizzying, complicated rush of notes, a waterfall of sound that was technically breathtaking. Leo could hear the precision, the years of practice, the sheer skill in every perfectly executed run. But as he listened, he felt nothing. The notes were perfect, like a string of perfect pearls, but they felt cold. There was no warmth in them, no story, no soul. It was a display of skill, not an expression of life. He thought of the simple melodies he played for Alina in the empty hall, tunes that were clumsy and imperfect, but were filled with everything he felt. A fresh wave of doubt washed over him. How could his simple, heartfelt music compete with this kind of flawless perfection? He was a fool. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He was just about to walk out to give up this crazy dream when the music from the speaker stopped. A moment later, a storm of applause erupted, so loud it made the walls hum. He sank back into his chair. It was too late to run now. A staff member with a clipboard opened the door and looked around. "Number 26, she called out. A young boy with a serious face stood up, straightened his jacket, and followed her out. Leo was next. His heart started to beat in a slow, heavy rhythm, like a drum counting down to an execution. He wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers. He looked at his contestant number 27 pinned to his chest. It felt like a target. He closed his eyes and pictured Elena's face, the way she would smile when he played a tune she especially liked. You play with your whole life, she had said. He took a deep, shaky breath. His whole life. That was all he had. The door opened again. The staff member looked at her clipboard, then at him. "Number 27, she said, her voice flat and professional. "It's time." Leo stood up, his body moving on its own, and followed her down a short, dimly lit hallway. The sound of his own footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. At the end of the hall was a heavy velvet curtain. The woman pulled it back just enough for him to slip through. "Good luck," she whispered. But her eyes said she didn't mean it. He stepped out onto the side of the stage, and the world exploded into light and sound. The concert hall was vast, a sea of dark velvet seats stretching up into the shadows, all of them filled with people. The air was warm and smelled of perfume and old wood. Glittering chandeliers hung from the high ceiling like captured stars. In the center of the huge stage, under a single bright spotlight, sat the grand piano. It was the same piano he cleaned every day, but tonight it was different. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a throne, and it seemed to glow with an inner light. A long, narrow walkway of polished black floor stretched from where he was standing to the center of the stage. It felt like a mile long. The announcer's voice, smooth and formal, echoed through the hall. "And now for our final contestant of the evening, we have number 27. He started to walk. Each step was an effort. He could feel 1,000 pairs of eyes on him. He heard a low murmur ripple through the audience, like a wave of whispers. He saw the faces in the front row, a mixture of curiosity and confusion. He saw the other finalists watching from the wings, their expressions a mixture of pity and smug amusement. He kept his eyes fixed on the piano, his only friend in this intimidating world. As he reached the center of the stage, the spotlight hit him full in the face, blinding him. He could just make out the shapes of the judges' table in the darkness ahead of them. He stopped and stood there, awkward and silent, waiting for some kind of instruction. The head judge, a man with a mane of silver hair and a stern, famous face, leaned into his microphone. It was Maestro Vincenzo, a legend in the world of classical music. Leo had seen his picture on posters in the conservatory hallways. He looked even more intimidating in person. The maestro stared at Leo for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he took in the simple, worn uniform, the rough hands, the nervous posture. A small, cynical smile played on his lips. "And you are?" he asked, his voice booming through the hall, laced with a heavy, dismissive accent. Leo flinched at the tone. He swallowed, his throat dry as dust. "My name is Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The maestro leaned back in his chair, a picture of condescending amusement. "Leo," he repeated, as if tasting the strange, simple name. "And who is your teacher, Leo? Which master have you studied under?" "I don't have a teacher, sir," Leo managed to say. "I taught myself." A few audible gasps came from the audience, followed by a smattering of laughter. Maestro Vincenzo held up a hand for silence, but his own smile widened. He was enjoying this. "You taught yourself," he said, making it sound like the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. "Fascinating. And what piece will you be astonishing us with tonight? Some little folk song you picked up, perhaps?" Leo just stood there, his face burning with shame. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead. The humiliation was a physical force, crushing him. He had known it would be hard, but he hadn't imagined this public mockery in front of hundreds of people. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, a strange insect to be prodded and laughed at. The maestro looked at the other judges, who were all smirking now. He turned back to Leo, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Look at you, my friend. You are very brave, but also very foolish. This stage is for artists, for virtuosos, who have dedicated their entire lives to their craft. It is not a place for hobbies." He paused, letting the insult sink in. "But since you have come all this way, we cannot send you away without playing something. So, I will make it easy for you. Why don't you play something? Simple? Something everyone knows? Perhaps chopsticks would be appropriate." The moment he said the name, the entire concert hall erupted in laughter. It wasn't just a chuckle this time. It was a loud, booming, united roar of amusement. The sound washed over Leo, hot and sharp. He saw the young, arrogant finalist from the lobby, the one with the perfectly tailored suit, laughing openly in the wings. He saw the faces in the audience contorted with mirth. They weren't just laughing at the suggestion. They were laughing at him, at his uniform, at his dreams, at his very presence on their sacred stage. The humiliation was complete. He felt his knees go weak. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He wanted to run, to disappear, to erase this moment from his life. But then, through the haze of shame and the roar of the laughter, he saw a face in his mind. It was Alina, sitting in the front row of the empty hall, her eyes closed, a gentle smile on her lips. "You play with your whole life," she had said. His whole life. This humiliation, this pain, this shame, it was all part of his life, and he could play it. He took a slow, deep breath, the air catching in his throat. He ignored the laughter. He ignored the smirking judges. He looked down at the piano, at the smooth white and black keys that had been his only confidants for so many years. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the maestro. Then he walked the last few steps and sat down on the bench. The laughter began to die down as the audience waited for the joke to play out. He looked small and out of place against the vast, empty stage, a single, humble man before a magnificent, gleaming piano. He placed his rough, calloused hands on the keys, the contrast stark and telling. The hall fell silent, waiting for him to begin the silly, simple tune. But Leo had something else in mind. The silence that followed the laughter was heavier than the laughter itself. It was a thick, suffocating blanket, pressing down on Leo, making it hard to breathe. The spotlight felt like a physical weight pinning him to the bench. He could feel the eyes of hundreds of people boring into him, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and lingering amusement. He was a joke, and the punchline was about to be delivered. He was supposed to play chopsticks. The very thought of it was a fresh wave of acid in his stomach. It would be the final confirmation of his foolishness, the perfect, humiliating end to this absurd adventure. His fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. He could feel the calluses on his fingertips, rough against the cool, smooth ivory. These were the hands of a man who worked with his back, not his fingers. What was he doing here? He closed his eyes, shutting out the blinding light, the judgmental faces, the vast, intimidating hall. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he was no longer on a stage. He was in the empty concert hall, late at night. The only light was the single bulb he had left on over the stage. And in the front row, sitting in the same seat every time, was Alina. He could see her so clearly, her head tilted slightly, a soft, encouraging smile on her face. She wasn't judging him. She was just listening. "You play with your whole life," she had said. His whole life. The joy, the sorrow, the love, the loss, the quiet dignity of a life lived in the shadows. It was all in there, a deep well of experience that these polished prodigies, with their perfect techniques and their sheltered lives, could never understand. He wasn't here to play notes. He was here to play his life. A sense of calm washed over him, a quiet resolve that settled deep in his bones. The trembling in his hands stopped. The shame and the fear were still there, but they were no longer in charge. They were just part of the music now. He opened his eyes, but he wasn't seeing the hall anymore. He was seeing only the keys, his old friends. He took a slow, deep breath, filling his lungs with the warm, still air. He let it out. And then he played. It wasn't a tune. It wasn't a melody. It was a single, resonant chord, played low on the piano. It was a sound so full and so deep that it seemed to vibrate up from the floorboards, through the bench, and into the very bones of everyone in the room. It was not the sound of chopsticks. It was the sound of a door creaking open in a long-abandoned house. It was the sound of a question asked in the dark. The note hung in the air, shimmering with a haunting melancholy that was so pure, so profound, that it instantly silenced every last whisper in the hall. The smirks vanished from the faces in the audience. The condescending amusement on the judge's table froze, then slowly melted away, replaced by a look of intense, bewildered curiosity. Maestro Vincenzo, who had been leaning back in his chair with a triumphant smirk, suddenly sat bolt upright. His eyes, which had been half closed in bored anticipation, were now wide open, fixed on the stage. He was a man who had heard every note ever written, played by the best fingers in the world. But this was different. This single note had more story in it than entire symphonies he had conducted. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his chin resting on his clasped hands, completely captivated. From the wings, the young, arrogant prodigy watched, his own smirk replaced by a frown of confusion. He had been expecting a clumsy, embarrassing performance. He had been ready to feel superior. But this sound, it was something else entirely. It was technically simple. Anyone could play a single chord. But the way this man played it, the weight and the emotion he put into it, was something his years of rigorous training had never taught him. It was a feeling, not a technique. After letting the first chord fade into a profound silence, Leo's fingers began to move. They didn't dance or fly across the keys like the other contestants. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like old friends telling a long, important story. A simple, flowing melody began to emerge. It was not a piece by Chopin or Liszt. It was something entirely his own. A composition born in the quiet hours of the night, shaped by a lifetime of unspoken words. The melody was like a slow, winding river, carrying with it hints of sadness and whispers of hope. It was the sound of a quiet morning, the feeling of a gentle hand in his. The memory of a shared laugh over a simple meal. As he played, Leo's posture changed. He was no longer the hunched, nervous janitor. He sat up straight, his shoulders back, his head held high. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of concentration and deep emotion. He was no longer aware of the audience, the judges, or the spotlight. He was lost in the world he was creating, a world built from the raw materials of his own heart. The music was his language. And for the first time in his life, he had a crowd that was forced to listen. They had come to laugh at a joke, but they were now hearing a confession. The melody began to grow in complexity. A new voice joining the quiet river of sound. It was a voice of struggle, of hardship. The notes became a little more urgent, a little more dissonant, speaking of long days of physical labor, of bills that couldn't be paid, of the quiet desperation of a life that felt like it was going nowhere. It was the sound of his calloused hands scrubbing floors, the ache in his back at the end of a double shift. The audience listened, spellbound. Many of them, the wealthy patrons and the proud parents, had never known such a life. But in this music, they could feel it. They could feel the grit, the fatigue, the quiet endurance of a man who had never been given a break. The young prodigy in the wings felt a strange pang of something he couldn't identify. It was a feeling of inadequacy. His own music, so perfect and so brilliant, suddenly seemed hollow, like a beautiful but empty shell. Then, just as the music reached a point of tense struggle, a new theme emerged. It was a theme of love, pure and simple. It was a melody so tender and so full of warmth that it felt like a ray of sunshine breaking through a cloudy sky. It was Elena. It was the way her eyes lit up when he came home. It was the sound of her humming in the kitchen. It was the feeling of her head on his shoulder as they sat on their small porch watching the sun go down. The music swelled with this love, a powerful, overwhelming wave of emotion that filled the entire hall. It was a love that had sustained him, that had given him strength when he had none, that had seen the musician in him when no one else did. A few people in the audience discreetly wiped away tears. The stern-faced Maestro Vincenzo stared, his own eyes glistening. His legendary composure completely shattered by the raw, unfiltered humanity pouring from the piano. He wasn't just listening to music anymore. He was listening to a man's soul, and it was stunning. The love theme hung in the air for a long moment, a warm, golden glow that seemed to soften the hard edges of the concert hall. It was a memory so beautiful, so pure, that it felt almost sacred. The audience was frozen, caught in that perfect, fleeting moment. They were no longer thinking about the man in the uniform or the joke of his presence. They were just feeling a love so deep and true that it transcended words and notes. But just as the melody began to soften, to fade like a beautiful dream, a change came over the music. A single, jarring note, sharp and out of place, cut through the warmth like a piece of broken glass. It was a sound of wrongness, of something broken that could never be fixed. The gentle river of music began to churn. The melody that had been so smooth and flowing became agitated, choppy. The notes were no longer telling a story of love. They were telling a story of pain. It was the sound of a hospital room, the beeping of machines, the hushed, desperate whispers of doctors. It was the feeling of a hand growing cold in his, the sight of a familiar face becoming a stranger. Leo's fingers, which had been moving with such graceful tenderness, now struck the keys with a desperate, frantic energy. The music became a storm, a chaotic clash of sound that was almost violent in its intensity. It was the sound of a heart breaking, of a world shattering into a million pieces. It was the raw, unfiltered scream of a man who had lost everything in the audience. A woman let out a small, choked sob, quickly covering her mouth with her hand. She wasn't the only one. The music was pulling emotions out of people they didn't know they had. It was tapping into a universal experience of loss, a pain that everyone, no matter how rich or successful, had felt or feared. The young prodigy in the wings stood frozen, his face pale. He had played pieces that were meant to be tragic, full of dramatic minor keys and crashing crescendos. But it was all acting, a performance of sadness he had learned from a teacher. This was different. This was not a performance. This was real. He looked down at his own hands, the hands he had always been so proud of. For the first time in his life, he saw them as useless. They could play notes, but they could not pour out a soul. Maestro Vincenzo was completely undone. The great maestro, the man who was a living legend, sat with his mouth slightly agape, his eyes fixed on the stage as if he were witnessing a miracle. He had spent his entire life pursuing the perfect interpretation of the great composers. He had taught thousands of students that the key to music was precision, discipline, and a deep understanding of theory. But this man, this janitor, was playing with a truth that made all of his knowledge seem like child's play. This was not in any book. This could not be taught. This was something you could only get by living, by loving, and by losing. He felt a tear slide down his own cheek, and he didn't even bother to wipe it away. The storm of music on stage reached its peak, a chaotic, heartbreaking crescendo of despair. It was the sound of a man alone in an empty house, the silence so loud it was deafening. It was the sound of a lifetime of memories turning into ghosts. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. Leo's hands lifted from the keys, and a profound, deafening silence fell over the hall. It was a silence that was heavier and more full of meaning than any sound. It was the silence of grief, of emptiness, of a world without color. Leo sat there, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. For a moment, he looked completely broken, a man defeated by life. The audience held its breath, their own hearts aching in sympathy. They thought it was over. They thought the story had ended in tragedy. But then, slowly, Leo's right hand moved back to the piano. His index finger, rough and worn, pressed down on a single white key in the middle of the keyboard. The note was quiet, but it was clear. It was a single, unbroken thread of sound in the vast emptiness. It was a sound of survival. It was the first breath taken after a long time underwater. It was the decision to get out of bed in the morning, even when the world felt like it had ended. From that single note, a new melody began to grow. It was not a happy melody. It was not a triumphant one. It was a melody of quiet strength, of resilience. It was the sound of a man picking up the pieces of his broken life and learning to live with the cracks. The notes were simple, direct, and honest. There was no flash, no technical wizardry. There was only a deep, unwavering resolve. It was the sound of going back to work, of mopping floors and fixing sinks, not with despair, but with a quiet dignity. It was the sound of finding a new purpose, not in grand achievements, but in the simple act of living a life that would have made her proud. The music was no longer about the joy of having her or the pain of losing her. It was about the honor of carrying her memory forward. As this new theme grew, Leo's posture changed again. He straightened his back, but this time it wasn't with defiance. It was with a quiet, settled peace. He was no longer fighting the pain. He had accepted it as a part of him, a part of his music. His eyes were still closed, but his face was no longer a mask of agony. It was serene. He was no longer just playing the piano. He was having a conversation with it, a conversation with his past, with his wife's memory, with his own soul. The music began to build again, not into a storm of chaos, but into a powerful, steady river of strength. It was the sound of a man who had been through the worst fire and had come out not unburned, but forged. He was showing them that true strength wasn't about never falling, but about always getting back up. And as the music swelled, filling the hall with a quiet, unshakable power, the audience knew they were not just listening to a song anymore. They were witnessing a testament to the human spirit. The music of quiet strength continued to flow from the piano, a steady, unwavering current of sound. It wasn't a victory march. It was something much deeper, much more real. It was the sound of a man learning to be whole again. As the melody progressed, it began to weave in threads from his journey. A faint echo of the initial haunting chord returned, but it was no longer just sad. It was now tinged with a sense of wisdom, the memory of pain that had been overcome. A gentle phrase from the love theme appeared, but it was no longer a memory of what was lost. It was a celebration of what he had been lucky enough to have. Leo was not just playing a song. He was telling the complete story of a life, with all its sorrow and its beauty, its endings and its new beginnings. His fingers moved with a certainty that was almost startling. It was the certainty of a man who had faced his deepest fears and had not been destroyed. The music built, not to a crashing climax, but to a broad, open expanse of sound, like looking out at a calm, endless sea after a long and terrible storm. It was a feeling of peace, a feeling of arrival. And then, from this wide, peaceful sound, he began to bring the music home. The notes became simpler, softer, more intimate. He was bringing the conversation to a close. He played one final gentle chord, a sound that was both a question and an answer, a farewell and a hello. He let his fingers rest on the keys, feeling the vibration die away into the wood, into the air, into the silence. And in that silence, the world changed. The concert hall was utterly, completely still. It was a silence so profound that it felt like a presence in the room. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. No one breathed. It was as if Leo had poured so much of his life into the music that the entire hall was now holding its breath, processing the raw, honest truth of what it had just heard. Leo sat at the piano, his head still bowed, his hands resting on the keys. He was exhausted, emptied out, but also strangely light. He had done it. He had played his song for Alina. He had kept his promise. For a long moment, he was not aware of the crowd or the judges. He was just a man and a piano in a quiet room saying goodbye. Then, a single sound broke the silence. It was the sharp, distinct clap of a pair of hands. It wasn't polite or tentative. It was a firm, decisive sound. Every head in the hall turned towards the judge's table. It was Maestro Vincenzo. The great, imposing maestro was on his feet, clapping slowly, deliberately. His eyes fixed on Leo with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He was not clapping for a performance. He was clapping for a revelation. As if his clap were a signal, another person joined in, then another and another. A wave of sound began to build, starting as a ripple and then growing into a roar. In a matter of seconds, the entire concert hall was on its feet. The applause was not just loud. It was overwhelming, a physical force that shook the very foundations of the building. It was a thunderous, deafening ovation, a wall of sound made of hands and hearts and souls that had been touched. People were cheering, whistling, shouting bravo. Tears were streaming down the faces of the wealthy patrons, the proud parents, the young students. They were not applauding a contestant in a competition. They were applauding a master artist who had just given them the gift of his truth. Leo slowly lifted his head, and looked out at the sea of people. The spotlight, which had felt so harsh and exposing before, now felt like a warm embrace. He saw the faces no longer filled with condescension or pity, but with gratitude and admiration. He saw a woman in the front row, her face buried in her husband's shoulder, her body shaking with sobs. He saw the stern-faced volunteer from the registration table, her mouth open in shock, her eyes wide with wonder. He saw the young finalists in the wings, their faces a mixture of shock and reverence. The sound washed over him, and he felt a dazed, humbled sense of disbelief. He had expected mockery, not this. He had expected to be a joke, not a revelation. He slowly stood up, his legs feeling unsteady. He gave a small, awkward bow, not like a performer, but like a simple man who was deeply, deeply moved by the kindness of strangers. As he turned to leave the stage, a figure stepped out from the wings. It was the young, arrogant prodigy, the boy in the perfectly tailored suit. But the arrogance was gone. In its place was a look of profound humility and respect. He stopped in front of Leo, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion, That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I have practiced for 10,000 hours. I can play every note perfectly. But I don't know anything." He looked down at his own hands, then back at Leo. "Please, what was the name of that piece?" Leo looked at the boy, at the genuine pain and newfound understanding in his eyes. He saw not a rival, but a fellow traveler on the long road of life. He offered a small, gentle smile. "I call it Elena's song," he said softly. The boy repeated the name as if it were a prayer. "Elena's song?" he whispered. "Thank you." He stepped aside, letting Leo pass. As Leo walked off the stage, a staff member guided him towards the side of the hall. The applause was still going, showing no signs of stopping. He was led back to the judges' table. Maestro Vincenzo stood up as he approached. The other judges followed his lead. "Mr. Leo," the maestro said, his voice filled with a respect that was a world away from the condescension he had shown earlier. "You have come here tonight with no teacher, no formal training, and you have taught us all a lesson. A lesson about what music truly is. It is not in the fingers. It is in the heart. Thank you." A few moments later, it was time for the awards. The announcer came back on stage, his own voice filled with a new sense of excitement. "And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. The winner of this year's Young Virtuoso competition and the recipient of the grand prize," he paused for dramatic effect, "is Julian." A smattering of polite applause followed as the young prodigy, Julian, walked onto the stage. But it was a hollow sound compared to the ovation Leo had received. Julian looked uncomfortable as he held the trophy. He looked out at the crowd, then towards the side of the stage where Leo was standing. He knew, as everyone in that hall knew, that the real prize had already been awarded. The trophy was just a piece of gold. The standing ovation, the tears, the shared moment of humanity, that was the true prize. And it belonged to Leo. Leo didn't wait for the final curtain. He quietly slipped out of the concert hall and into the now empty lobby. The marble floor was still polished, the chandeliers still glittered, but the room felt different now. It was no longer an intimidating world of wealth and status. It was just a room, and he was no longer just the janitor. He was a man who had walked onto a stage as a joke and had walked off as a legend. As he walked out into the cool night air, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had stunned everyone, yes, but more importantly, he had kept his promise. He had let the world hear Elena's song, and in doing so, he had finally learned to hear his own.